All right, what I'm going to do is try to condense a number of themes here in 20 minutes and really open it up for extended discussion. I think some of the more interesting information and scenarios will come from Q&A here. So I'm going to try to keep it fairly brief here as a way of getting into Q&A and more substantive material. First thing I want to say is that this virus is not a health crisis impacting the economy. You got to think of the health crisis, the virus effect, as precipitating and accelerating trends that were already clearly emerging in the US and global economy. You know, you hear from Trump that, oh, you know, the economy was great and it's just this virus thing. And when the thing is over, virus is over, we're going to snap back. And you even get economists like Robert Reich and Paul Krugman, you know, parroting the same thing. Oh, it's a health crisis. When the health crisis is over, the economy will snap back to where it was. That's nonsense. And I'll explain why that's nonsense. If you look at the economy, US and global last year, what did we see? We saw in the US a manufacturing recession already in effect for months. We saw a contraction of real investment, you know, in plant and equipment, business investment that drives the economy fundamentally. That was contracting for 9 months. We had a trade war that had flattened out the trade contribution to economic growth. And even consumer spending, which last year they were saying was holding everything up. By the end of the year, yeah, it was holding it up at the top end. The wealthy folks, 10%, were spending because it was a hot stock market, and you know, wealth effect drives spending at the top end. But if you look at the middle class in the middle, which is the working class, you know, if you look at it, well, we were spending mostly on credit cards, and that was beginning to falter because the defaults on credit cards in the last quarter last year was up to between 8 and 9%. Normal is 2%. Well, folks were already defaulting on their credit cards, and student defaults were significant and rising, although they cover that up quite a bit in the education department. And auto loans, 7 million people had turned in their keys to their auto loans. So clearly the consumer, the working class consumer, was tapped out. And it was only a matter of time before that really turned down. Globally, global trade for the first time ever had flattened out. There was no growth in global trade. And for the first time since records were being kept, global trade was growing less than global GDP, which was also weakening. We had recessions emerging in many places around the world, particularly those economies dependent on oil and commodity production. That was occurring. We had instability in exports and currencies, you know, places all over the world, from Latin America to Turkey to South Africa and so forth. These were the weak links that were already beginning to appear. And oil prices, you know, that are collapsing now unprecedentedly, and we'll talk about that, but oil prices were also significantly fading last year. They were down to the $30, $40 a barrel from $70 a barrel. So, you know, that direction was going south already. China was slowing down, covering up its slowdown, you know, through various ways, but it was significantly slowing. So was India. So the global economy, US economy, was fairly weak going into this. And then we got this hammer effect from the virus and its effect. First, it hit China. China's economy pretty much shut down in a number of ways. It then spilled over to Northeast Asia, Korea and Japan, and then to Southeast Asia, you know, Singapore and Thailand and places like that. And then it spilled over from there to the Southern European periphery, Italy and Spain, and to some extent the Middle East, Iran. Then from there to the rest of Europe and Latin America and the USA. The USA, the infections came in through China. You hear Trump say, oh, I shut down you know, visits from China. Well, that's another one of his bald-faced lies, because 40,000 people, after his announcement in January, 40,000 people came in from China. They were American business people and Chinese business people who were still allowed in, and it didn't count the ones that came in through Mexico or Canada, right? So we had 40,000 people coming in, and then if you remember, he was very late on preventing people coming in from Europe, particularly from Italy. And then he made the asinine temporary ruling that, oh, you could come in from the UK, but not from Europe, continental Europe, right? So a lot of the problems in New York were people coming in from Europe, but on the West Coast, it was people coming in from Asia still. Just one of the many examples of Trump, extreme mismanagement of the whole thing, but, he is the prince of liars, and, he completely obfuscates the mismanagement of the whole situation, which exacerbated the virus effect in the United States. And then, of course, we then see once it hits the United States, we have a sort of sequence of industries that are impacted and layoffs that follow. The first impact, of course, was on the travel industry, airlines, cruise lines, hotels, restaurants. That was the first wave that virtually shut down. But also shut down was a lot of trade, oil and energy, autos, auto parts, export trade, and so forth. Those sectors began to have an impact. And then when we had sheltering in place in some of the states, what we got then was a third wave of shutdowns and unemployment from local services. In other words, restaurants, sports, personal services, education, malls, retail, entertainment, all that began to shut down. And now, although it's hidden to a significant extent, I think, we have the food production and distribution sector being impacted now. You hear about the meatpacking plants, pork and so forth, where the virus is spreading. I think they're kind of keeping that under wraps quite a bit because they don't want to panic people. But I think that's a serious situation going on now. And they've been able to prevent the shutdown of the healthcare industry because of its, so crucial. And to some extent, the states have been able to mitigate that a little bit. But we see these rolling industries, and of course, resulting in mass layoffs occurring as it rolls through the economy. And the latest unemployment figures, applications for benefits today, 5 million on top. We got about 27 million people who are laid off in just the last 6 weeks. And that raises the unemployment rate, even not counting those who haven't gone through and gotten registered for benefits. There's probably several million more. That puts us at about 16 to 17% of unemployment right now. And various bank research departments, I think B of A, maybe it's Chase, I'm not sure, estimate we're going to have 40 million people unemployed by the end of May. 40. That's 25% unemployment. That's 1932-33 levels of unemployment. Right? Now, the bailout bill for the unemployed, is really only good for 6 to 8 weeks. All right, so what do you got? You got the $1,200 a month, $1,200 flat per person income supplement. In the big $1,200 per person, so $2,400. If you're single, it's only $1,200. That won't even cover your first month rent. If you live in a big city anywhere. So it's really insufficient. Many of the people who have filed for unemployment in this number aren't getting it because it's overwhelming the state unemployment systems. They can't get through. The $600 supplement is good for only 4 months. So that costs $500 billion, that amount. But that's just a small part of the total bailout of businesses going on. Look, we had the $250 billion for small business, the bailout for small business, $250 billion. That was gobbled up quickly. as the big banks shuffled the money to their largest customers and their best customers first and left out the really small businesses. By the way, small was defined as 500 million or 500 employees or less, not so small. And the big part of that small, the large end of that small, got most of this stuff. And it was gamed in a number of ways. Private equity firms who have franchises of less than 500 people were able to get in and get the money, even though they were sitting on $1 trillion of assets. Restaurant chains, their franchisees were able to get in and get it. And also each of their small locations were able to apply for it. So there's a lot of gaming of the system that was going on in that 250 billion small business package, which was gobbled up in just 2 weeks. And now, of course, today they just passed 310 billion more for small business. But the problem is, contrary to the CARES Act that was passed, which called for an inspector general and called for a board to oversee how this money was being distributed, it's been totally inoperative because Trump has said, I'm the inspector general. I'm going to give the money. And of course, he gives the directions where to give it to his friends. Even some of it probably to cruise lines. Who knows? So we got this problem. It's not getting out there. And the average small business has only 27 days of cash flow. After that, it runs out. Runs out of money. After that, they're technically out of business. And the flow of money is not really getting to them, and they're at the end of that 27 days, many of them. So that's the 250 plus 310 billion. Now, on top of that, the Fed provides 500 billion to large businesses. Those that have more than 10,000 employees are going to get to dabble into that 500 billion package. And that includes like airlines who are going to get billions at a time. Now, the airlines were making super profits here up until this. The airlines, for example, are going to get $58 billion of that 500 billion. But they gave $43 billion in stock buybacks and dividend payouts in recent years to their shareholders. So what? We're supposed to fill the black hole that they've given to their shareholders? Well, why don't we just nationalize them in some way? No, that's not on the table here, of course. That would be too radical for a pro-enterprise, pro-market kind of a president and government that we have now. Boeing. Boeing gets Boeing and suppliers get $61 billion. Well, that's just to bail them out for an airplane that couldn't fly, really. And they gave themselves all kinds of stock buybacks and dividend payouts. Look, under Trump, in just the last 3 years under Trump, U.S. Fortune 500 companies alone have given themselves $3.4 trillion in stock buybacks and dividend payments. $3.4 trillion. Under Obama, it was $6 trillion over 7 years. But in half of that time, it's $3.4 trillion. Of stock buybacks and dividend payouts. Many of the large companies that are getting, being able to tap into the 500 billion are flush with cash. They're bloated with cash. They knew this thing was coming in early January and February, and what did they do? They issued corporate bonds at a record level of hundreds of billions of dollars in order to, add to their cash hoard. At the same time, they drew down their credit lines with banks to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars, and they added that to their cash hoard. And they're cutting costs in various ways. Most of the big business in America is sitting fat and happy. They don't need a damn penny. But they're taking advantage of it to funnel money, not just to airlines and Boeing, but to these other players as well. And we don't know who's getting it because we don't have an inspector general. We don't know how much and who's getting what. We don't have a board that's functioning. And even in the small business loan of $250 billion, the SBA, Small Business Agency, refuses to tell Congress and anybody, the media, who got how much of their 1.6 million loans. It's a big obfuscation going on. And of course, that means they got something to hide, and they're gaming the damn system. It's called the PPE, Payroll Protection Act, and it's supposed to go half of its loans and half of its grants. Well, the loans will be converted to grants. You can count on that later on. But the loans are supposed to be only if the company is able to maintain its employment levels, its payroll levels. Well, there's ways of gaming that too, You just say, oh, the layoffs that we got, and Boeing did this, were already scheduled before the act was passed. So, we won't lay any off going forward, but, this was already in the pipeline. Of course, all they need to do is create a paper trail to justify that, right? Or you're getting companies that weren't going to lay off anyway are getting the money and the loans and say, see, we didn't lay off. There's all kind of ways to game the system, and when no one's looking at it, which no one is, boy, they're stealing it right and left at hundreds of billions. It's a massive subsidization of businesses, corporations in particular, big businesses. Now, I mentioned the 250 billion and plus 310 now for small business and the 500 for the big corporations. Well, in addition to that, the Fed has just indicated 600 billion more for what's called its Main Street program, which is middle-sized businesses between 500 and 10,000 employees and $2.5 billion in revenue. Middle size, right? Pretty big middle, but they're going to get $600 billion, and that includes creditors, like the credit card companies. If people default, they're going to bail out the credit card companies. Junk bond, like in the energy, the fracking sector, junk bond companies, they're going to bail them out. They're going to bail out just about everybody else. You add it up, 300 billion, 310, 250, 600, 500, trillions of dollars. Now, keep in mind that the Fed is really the source of the bailout, except for the unemployment insurance and the $1,200 checks. Everything's going through the banks. The Fed is providing the funding to the private banks, and all of those trillions loans are being dispersed through the private banking system, and the big banks, the Chases and the Wells, are skimming off their fees and who knows what else as their share. The fees are at least 5%. I don't know what loan origination, or whatever else is going to be, or their rates, but they're going to make big money out of this whole thing. And it all goes through the Fed. And the Fed is now the garbage can for all capitalist debt. You see, it's not just bank debt or shadow banks, but it's all corporations of all sizes now. This is what's really radical. The Fed, has become the public bank for business. Now, why shouldn't we have a public bank for the rest of us? Why are we bailing out the credit card companies? Why don't we bail out the credit card holders? Why are we bailing out the mortgage servicers? Why don't we bail out the homeowners? Well, because everything goes through the banks in this economy, this finance capital dominated capitalist economy in the 21st century. Who's calling the shots? It's the bankers. Where does the leading policymakers in the Trump administration come from? Well, they come from Goldman Sachs and some of the other places, banks. And it's the same thing for the Federal Reserve. They're all bankers. It's a financial capital world now. That's not to say that, industrial capital doesn't exist, but the finance capital is in the driver's seat, and it has been for 20 years, I believe. And they're taken care of first. And that's the role of the Federal Reserve. It's really a Fed bailout, as it was in 2008-9. Congress did not bail out the banks in 2008-9. No, they passed this TARP program of $700 billion, and then the Treasurer Secretary Paulson calls into banks, and he finds out that it's $1 trillion bailout. So what does he do? Oh, he throws a little bit of money at the AIG, the insurance company, and some money at the auto companies, and then he sends the rest of the billions, 300 billion, back to the Treasury, and they turn to the Federal Reserve to bail everybody out, which it does to the tune of $4.5 trillion over 18 months. Oh, well, now the Fed is committed to $9 trillion in a whole host of programs, more than those I've just mentioned here, to bail out the banks, even before the banks fail this time, preemptively to bail out the banks. You know, back in 2008, the banks did start to fail and they had to bail them out. But now they're bailing them out even before it happens because they know massive defaults are coming throughout the economy, whether it's in the fracking, the energy, the retail companies, you know, are announcing bankruptcies already. You know, Lord and Taylor and Neiman Marcus and JCPenney's the next, and all kind of big box and other retail companies, and the junk bond companies, the fracking companies are going under. Next we're going to have auto supply and hotels and so forth. They know this is coming. So the Fed is pumping trillions into the banks so that the debt defaults don't hit the balance sheets of the banks. This is a big experiment, you see, and we'll see whether the Fed and this massive money infusion into business, into the capitalist first, can prevent the defaults from causing another banking financial system crash. Because if the financial system crashes, and there's no guarantee it won't, then you are really in a Great Depression scenario. Because that's what a Great Depression is. It's a collapse of a multiple collapse of financial sectors. You know, 1929, the stock market went under, and we had a crisis in the real economy. That was just, it wasn't a depression yet. It was a Great Recession, and it had begun even before the October 29 crash. But then we had a banking crash in late 1930s, another one in 31, another one in 32, another one in 33, and each time the economy ratcheted down lower and lower, and unemployment went higher and higher. So a Great Depression requires a financial crash, and that hasn't happened yet. But you know, the conditions for such and defaults in the non-financial sector are building, and it remains to be seen whether the Fed bailing out the banks preemptively will be able to prevent these defaults in the rest of the economy occurring. I think it's a 50-50 chance that they won't, despite the trillions they're throwing at it. But time will tell. Time will tell. That's why they're so urgently trying to get everybody back to work. You see, the capitalists have come to the conclusion, we'll take the deaths, right? We'll take the deaths and let it develop a herd mentality. It doesn't matter if a couple million people die. That's okay. We got to keep our business going. This isn't just Trump trying to open it up. You see, this is the capitalists who are knocking on his door, meeting with him and saying, open up, because our revenue and our companies are more important than grandma and grandpa, who may die off, and they're going to die anyway. This is the way these guys think, you know. Their businesses come first, and okay, that's just collateral damage, and we have to accept it in a war situation. And that's, of course, what we're in. We're in a war situation, but we don't have a war mobilization going on. We don't have a war economy. You know, in 1941, the government was 15% of GDP. In 1 year, in 42, 40% of GDP. The government took over businesses. It built factories. It requisitioned resources and supplies. It ran the economy. And that was war mobilization. It put controls on prices. It threw business people who violated into jail. Do you see Trump doing anything like that? No way, right? It's just a facade. You know, he authorizes the War Production Act, and then he does nothing with it. And he's not going to do anything with it. He's going to rely on the private sector to do it. But the private sector is going to take care of itself first and foremost, you see, not the country. So that's the scenario that we're facing. And if the shutdown goes on for several more months, it's going to be harder and harder to prevent an even more serious crisis. So the capitalists are right that they got to get their economy open for themselves. But when they do so, and their politicians do so, what does it say about what they care about the health of American people? Right? It pretty much reveals what their real interests are and what their real intents are. So I'm watching this very closely, what's happening on the financial side. And of course, we'll see what happens on the real side of the economy, which I think is going to continue to contract. There will not be a V-shaped recovery. The economy is seriously wounded under the best of circumstances. If we had a vaccine tomorrow, it would not snap back, because businesses, many of them are going to go out of business, small business, they're never coming back. Those that do come back are going to be very, very cautious about hiring and very cautious about cutting costs and continuing to cutting costs. They're certainly not going to give raises. They're going to do everything they can to cut their wage costs, and they're not going to invest in new expansion and new production that would hire new people. We're going to have chronic unemployment, double digit, for years going forward here. And of course, the consumers themselves are very harmed, very wounded by this. And, even if they get some jobs back or get unemployment, they're going to hoard, because they don't know what the future is going to bring. Neither businesses nor consumers know what's coming around the corner. Is there going to be a second wave, a third wave, which always happens with these viruses? What's going to happen then before the election? If there's another wave before the election, what's going to happen to the election itself? I would not put it past Trump to somehow disturb the conducting of the election, or declaring after the election, if he loses, that it was fraudulent and refusing to step down. That sounds a little bit conspiratorial and extreme, but if this situation worsens, I don't rule that out. That might happen. He certainly does not want voting by mail. He's going to do everything he can to prevent that, voting by mail. And he's got the Supreme Court in his hip pocket to help him do that. So what happens in the next 6 months is going to be very interesting, in both in terms of the financial system, and both in terms of how bad off in terms of psychology and expectations will consumers and businesses be here throughout the summer and early fall of next year. I see a very much of a elongated U-shaped recovery here. We're going to stumble along for years with high unemployment and low wage growth and basic consumption and no investment. So it's not a sharp recovery. The last Great Recession, not as worse as this one, it took us 6 years just to get the jobs back that we had in 2007. We didn't get back to the level of employment to 2015. And then the jobs that came back were much lower pay and part-time temp gig jobs compared to the jobs we lost. So we're going to have the same effect for the working class, right? A lot of joblessness, a lot of low pay, and of course, everybody is tapped out in terms of credit, unlike they were in 2007. And business itself, various sectors, is going to be significantly harmed. You're not going to see anybody jump on airlines and go to Las Vegas, and jump into the resorts. You'll see some, doing that, but those are the dumb ones, and Darwin's going to get them in the end. So that's the way I see the scenario. It's a rather negative scenario, but one that I think is more realistic than all this Pollyanna talk about V-shaped recovery and we're going to get a virus tomorrow and so forth. This is the new normal, and it's not a very positive normal. And we're going to see what happens to the political system. You can't rule out dramatic developments and changes in the political system, including the elections coming up. That's hard to predict, but there's a couple of scenarios, worst case and best case kind of scenarios that you can imagine. But it's going to be a very interesting time, and it's going to make or break the Democratic Party, I think, if they can't come up to the challenge. and provide an alternative here. Or if they lose the election, it's the beginning of the end, I think, of the Democratic Party, and opportunities, I think, for new political party alignments and formations after the election.
So one of my questions has to do with housing. I'm curious what you think is going to happen in the housing market moving forward. Just I have a lot of friends that I've been connected to people who risk of losing their housing because they can't pay rent, and there's some moratoriums, but they all require that rent be paid back ultimately in the end. And yeah, so I was wondering if you had any predictions or ideas of what might happen moving forward with that. And then I'm also curious as to what, I guess it's a big question, but more about what would really mean or cause this to be a real depression rather than a recession. And I know you kind of were getting into that, but yeah, I just would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay. Well, on the housing, you want me to address rental housing or mortgages, or both?
Both, I think, because they seem connected to me.
Yeah, right. Okay. As far as rents are concerned, if this thing goes on more than another month or so, there's going to have to be some kind of rent moratorium, right? At least for rents that involve these large businesses that hold a lot of apartment buildings, right? There has to be some kind of moratorium in that regard. What's holding it up is politics, because what's holding it up is the owners, the landlords, sometimes have investors they have to pay, right? And if they don't get the rents, they can't pay the investors. And the investors are saying, if you don't pay us, these are corporations, these apartment landowning corporations, then they default, right? And if they default, then the investors lose their money. So there's a lot of resistance now from investors trying to prevent rental moratoriums. Now that's different than an individual who has a second or third house, he inherited from his folks or something, and he rents it out. That's a different scenario. The real important scenario are these large chains, apartment chains, held by hedge funds and equity firms and so forth, that bought up a lot of apartments after the last crisis, and they're insisting on being paid the rent from whoever manages the property, and that's why we haven't had a moratorium yet on rents. But that has to come. That has to come, because then you'll just have people doing a rent strike, right? We're not going to pay, and they're going to resist being evicted, and it's going to be kind of hard to evict people en masse, right? So I see a rent moratorium movement that's soon going to appear here if they don't do something on moratorium on rents. Now, on mortgages and housing, it's something similar. Most of the big banks, that if you have your mortgage with a big bank, they will then take your mortgage, your principal and interest, and they will tack it on to the end of the term. So if you have a 30-year mortgage, they tack 3 more months onto the end of it. And in the meantime, you have forbearance, as they call it. You don't have to make payments. And really, it's a way of gathering more cash flow for a lot of folks. But 80% of the people in this country live paycheck to paycheck, and without a paycheck, they can't pay their mortgage anyway, right? So it's not as if they're saving any money. If you have a job, you're saving some money. But if you don't, your mortgage, is really something you can't afford to pay. Why they're not doing that with the apartments and this forbearance where you move it forward 3 months, there's no reason why they shouldn't, except you got resistance from the investors on these apartment complexes going on. Right? These are moneyed people. These are private equity people. These are not your local landlord. He's often just a manager, you see, of the whole thing. It's really interesting why the 30-year Treasury bill is down to 1.2%, but mortgages are still 3.5% to 4%. Well, the reason for that is that while mortgage companies would like to lend more to people to buy homes, we're talking about mortgages now, right? The investors to whom they would then sell that mortgage don't want to buy those mortgages. They don't want to put up the money to buy those mortgages because they don't know whether people are going to foreclose. They don't know who can afford a mortgage now, truly, because if they're unemployed and whatever. So they're not putting up the money, the investment, to allow loans for people who want to buy houses. That's why interest rates are staying relatively high. Again, it's the investors in the background here, both with regard to rent and the mortgage industry, who are really the roadblock to solutions to housing here, in terms of solutions that would forbear both rent and forbear both mortgages, as well as initiate new mortgages. So the housing industry is kind of stuck, in the middle. And it's a good indication why that sector is not going to lead us out of this recession. It's kind of, stuck with its problems. Well, recently the government said, well, we'll get Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are these government agencies that buy debt, mortgage debt. We'll get them to buy up the mortgage debt, right? Well, we'll see whether that works. But the lenders are concerned about that because they have to pay a fee to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to do that. Right? These are the quasi-government agencies that buy mortgage debt. A bank issues the mortgage and then they sell it to Fannie and Freddie. See, they get out of the liability of it all. And that's supposed to stimulate the lending on home owning and so forth. But it would be an easy solution. Why Fannie and Freddie have to charge a fee? Just get the interest rates down and do it, right? But that would require more funding of Fannie and Freddie. And, guys like Mitch McConnell, they don't give a damn about the states and whether the states have money to pay for first responders and so forth. They don't give a damn about the housing industry. All they really care about are the big corporations. So that would be my answer to that.
My question is simple. I've never really been able to truly wrap my head around what the Federal Reserve actually is, and how can we yesterday not have $2.5 trillion and then today we have $2.5 trillion that is suddenly dispersed throughout the economy. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of explain that, and then also what kind of effects does that have in terms of like inflation and aggravating structural weaknesses in the economy when you introduce all this money so quickly?
Okay. All right. Well, that's a big question. Let me try to answer it briefly as I can. I wrote a 400-page book on it in 2017, Central Bankers at the End of Their Ropes. But it's a very important question because most folks, have only a vague understanding of how the central bank, the Federal Reserve, works with the private banks to really control the show, And the central bank of the Fed was set up in 1913 to bail out the banks. That's the first function of a central bank, to always bail out the banks whenever they get in trouble, and they periodically do because they're chasing big profits and speculating and taking big risks. They get into trouble, and that's why the bank was set up to bail out the banks, so that Congress didn't have to bail out the banks. You see, because if the banks cause a crisis, and then Congress takes money from the taxpayer to bail them out, well, those politicians aren't going to be very popular, are they? So to shield the politicians from the blame in the bailout, they create the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, this is important, does not use taxpayer money. The Federal Reserve creates money, you see, along with the private banks. The two of them together create the money supply. And what the Fed is doing, and these 600 billion, 250 billion, 500 billion, as I said, is all going through the banking system. What the Federal Reserve simply does is create money and say, okay, Chase and Wells Fargo, whatever, and now you non-bank companies, we're opening up an account for you, an electronic account on our server here, free money. Come and get it, right? And we're going to assume you're going to take it and you're going to make a loan with it. And the loan is going to stimulate the economy 2 or 3 times. That's called the multiplier effect, right? And then we're going to get to that 600 billion, 500 billion stimulus. But it's not like you're raising taxes and you're taking the taxes and giving it to the Fed, and the Fed is then giving it to the bank or giving it to the airline company or giving it to Boeing. That's not how it works. You know, it's creating money. They're creating money and they're throwing it at the system. That's what they did. They created $4.5 trillion in the last crisis, and now they've already indicated $9 trillion. They're prepared, and you know, that's open-ended as well. But that's how the bailout actually occurs. Now, will it cause inflation? Well, there's the school of economic thought that says too much money causes inflation, but you know, that's absolute nonsense, because if that were true, the trillions of dollars that the Fed has created and pumped into the economy for decades now, we haven't seen any inflation, right? We should see superinflation after $4.5 trillion last time, but we had a hard time even getting to 2%. But we see inflation in financial assets, in stocks and bonds and so forth. So what that means is that the money the Fed is creating is ultimately going through companies and investors, and it's going into stocks and bonds and derivatives and foreign exchange and all these financial assets, causing these bubbles, which means you got this interesting contradiction, right? That the Fed bails out a crisis by throwing mountains of money at it, but those mountains of money then create the basis for the next financial excesses and the next financial bubbles and the next crisis. The solution to the crisis becomes the cause of the next crisis. And we've been going on like that for 4 decades now, and it's getting worse and worse. That's the nature of 21st century capitalism, or one of its characteristics. Right? What are the effects? The effects are we're going to see more financial speculation. And as we see more of this money being diverted into financial markets and assets, globally, by the way, we see less and less of it actually getting into those companies, particularly the small ones, that are responsible for making things and services that hire people, that create income and create wages. You see, over time, less and less of this massive mountain of money is going into real investment that create jobs, and more is going into financial side of the economy. And why is that? Because the financial speculation is far more profitable than it is making things anymore. And that's how capitalism has changed in the 21st century as well.
Hello. I was curious. I was wondering, after this crisis, I imagine we're going to see a lot more austerity measures enacted by the government. So I was wondering if you could talk about like what those will look like and what you think is going to be cut and everything having to do with that.
Okay, very good question. Before the crisis hit, we were on track last year to have a government budget deficit of $1.4 trillion. And we've had, on average, $1 trillion deficits for most of the time under Obama, and they got worse under Trump. Why do we have deficits? That means you're spending more or cutting taxes more than you're bringing in revenue. Okay, why do we have $1 trillion deficits under Trump every year and rising, even though we're not even in a recession yet? Because Trump gave $4.5 trillion in tax cuts to the Fortune 500 and rich people in 2018, $4.5 trillion. They say $1.5 trillion in the media, but that excludes the tax cuts that he gave to U.S. multinational corporations' profits overseas. Pretty much eliminated all that. And it assumed that the economy was going to grow and generate tax revenue at a rate of 3 to 4% GDP every year without a recession. Well, not only did the 3 or 4% did not happen, but the recession came, and it's a biggie, right? So tax revenue is falling off, which means the deficit is going to get much worse. In 2009, by the way, he gave another $429 billion in tax loopholes to businesses. So, it's like $5 trillion, $5 trillion over the decade, right? But in last year, it was like $300-400 billion. in just 1 year, tax cuts to corporations. And now, of course, the loopholes. And now, they've cut the payroll tax for business. And behind this CARES Act are all kind of further tax cuts as well, the totals of which we don't know. But some real big provisions. They don't talk about it much, but it's carrying on this tax cut that we've seen for 20 years now, that has cut taxes for wealthy and corporations and businesses, $15 trillion of tax cuts since George W. Bush, 15 trillion, and that includes Obama, 5 to 6 trillion. Right? And of course, defense spending rises by hundreds of billions every year, and that contributes to the deficit. Now, to answer your question, we have a massive deficit that's growing even more. The estimates are the deficit for this year is not going to be 1.4 trillion. It's going to be $3.9 trillion added to the national debt of 23 trillion. 3.9 trillion, and then next year 3.7 trillion on top of that. Massive deficits increase. That means what? They either have to cut taxes, which they're not going to do politically, with this kind of pro-business economy and political government, right? They're not going to cut taxes. They're not going to cut defense spending. What are they going to cut? They're going after Social Security this time, no doubt about it, right? That's the big pie, and of course they're going to cut education, and they're going to cut the transport and all the other discretionary areas. So yes, next year we will see. Next March, when they put together the budget for the next fiscal year, we're going to see massive cuts, no matter who gets elected, whether it's Biden or Trump. Biden's going to do an Obama, and that is, he's going to talk the talk, and when then he gets elected, he's going to do what his advisors want him to do. So yes, austerity is coming in a magnitude we've never seen before. And it's going to now, for the first time, I think, really go after Social Security, big time, as well as other areas like education and healthcare and so forth. Well, maybe healthcare not because of the crisis, but that's what we're going to see. It's going to be a big problem.
Hello, Jack. There are several of us in Baltimore listening, and we are very pleased to have the opportunity both to listen and to have some dialogue with you. Thank you. My question is, looking at the next few years, you mentioned, for example, 8 years or more for the working class in terms of coming back in various ways, where that's the same kind of time frame that we're talking about with climate change becoming irreversible, the crisis obviously deepening in the intermediate years between here and there. I recognize that you're not a climate scientist, but I am wondering if you have any thoughts on the interaction of the deepening climate crisis with the economic factors that you've been talking about. What are the implications?
Well, in my book, published just a couple of months ago in January, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, I have a chapter that talks about the next decade. And there's really three great contradictions that 21st century capitalism faces. One is the climate crisis. The other is what we're seeing right now, this massive debt, how they deal with this massive debt, because the massive debt holds back real investment. And the climate crisis is going to take a lot of real investment. So the debt crisis is the second great contradiction. The third great contradiction is what's going to happen to the labor markets this coming decade. And now this crisis will accelerate what's going to happen. What's going to happen is artificial intelligence is going to devastate and decimate jobs. Artificial intelligence is a big cost saver for business, and they're going to push it. And what it means is they eliminate simple decision-making jobs. McKinsey & Consultants has estimated that 30% of the occupations are either going to be lost or their hours significantly cut. Now, how are they going to deal with that massive loss of employment or underemployment, even greater than we had going into this crisis, which was a problem already? 50, 60 million people of 165 million in the labor force were either part-time, gig, temp, or contract workers, right? Which meant lower pay and no benefits. What's going to happen is business now is going to accelerate their cost cutting, as they do in all crises, and we're probably going to see this effect, this AI effect, as I call it, hitting the economy in the next 3 or 4 years. So these three crises, you see, the changes in technology in the labor market, the massive excess debt that exists, and the climate crisis are all converging at once. That's why I argued in the book that neoliberalism as we know it, policies cannot deal with this crisis, that there's going to be a change in the policy mix that will be something other than neoliberalism, which will be either more right-wing, proto-fascist kind of policy, corporatist policies, or it's going to be more progressive, depending on whether political mobilization can challenge that. But that's where I see this going. And the key to the climate crisis is that are you going to have the investment in alternative energy and all the other investment that you need that can only come from the government? Because individual businesses are not going to step up to that. They're going to take care of their own, and only governments can do it. But if the government's controlled by the finance capitalists, it's probably not going to happen. So, there's great opportunities for political innovation this coming decade. Great opportunities as never before. Particularly if the Democrats fail. And so far, I think they've been, if you calculate it all, they've not been doing so well. And it's really questionable whether they can really displace Trump for another 4 years. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for political innovation. And I really think people are going to get together and as the crisis worsens here, the triple crisis, as I'm calling it, we're going to see whether people step up and take control of the situation themselves, which I'm optimistic they will.
Yeah. So I wanted to get back to this moment. So I guess my question is, before this virus hit, you already said the economy was fragile, debt-ridden, and many economists, including yourselves, were anticipating another massive economic downturn coming anytime soon. And this virus has now, by shutting up the economy, has forced all of the constriction that you've talked about. But that doesn't mean that massive predicted economic crisis has hit yet. We've just seen the economy be squeezed up and slowed to a halt. And so Trump and others are saying the faster we can get it back going again, we'll just return to the state we were before. So I'm trying to wrap my head around how you see why can't they, or can they, just get it going again, back to the state it was before? Or how would we know whether or not this has triggered a crisis? Are we only going to be able to know once they open it up again? Or is there going to be signs even right now that show that crisis has begun to hit?
Good question. What I said, and I missed the first questioner here answering the second part, which is really kind of what you're answering, and that is you get an exacerbation, a severe exacerbation of the current crisis as it is when the financial system freezes up, and it's questionable. It's not, we don't know whether this massive experiment by the Federal Reserve of throwing multiple trillions is going to prevent a crisis on the financial side, which will exacerbate and drive down the regular economy even further. We don't know yet. That's the jury's not out, it's still out on that one. But as far as short of that, as I said before, there's no old normal. There's no going back to the old normal. Even under the best of circumstances, if we were able to recover from this thing, business and consumer psychology and expectations are going to be very, very cautious. And that's why you're going to have a very, very slow recovery, even slower than we had with a similar situation with business and consumers back in 2008, 9, 10, right? I see the same scenario, perhaps even worse in terms of a recovery. Because the jobs are not going to be there, the wages are not going to be there, the investment is not going to be there. Everyone's going to be cautious and careful. Certain industries will never come back to where they were. People aren't going to jump on airlines and fly around anymore. That's just not going to happen. And a lot of sectors of the economy are going to be in the same condition. It's not going to happen. So it depends on, yes, they'll bring people back. I think they will have to open it from their own interest, capitalist interest. They will have to open it. It's unknown how bad a second wave of the health effect will occur. We don't know. A health expert says the second wave will definitely occur. These viruses have always had the second and even third waves. We don't know how bad that will be. We don't know how much the economy might come back if they opened it up. But even if they opened it all up under the best of circumstances, I'm still arguing that expectations by business and consumers is really wounded and will not come back. And therefore, jobs and wages will not come back very quickly. And we have the historical example of the previous crisis to substantiate that. And if the effect is very serious and we have to shut down again, I don't think they will shut down again. You see, I think even if there's a second wave, they're going to tough through it and they will not shut down again because, how much more can they bail it out is the question. I don't think they can go through another round of this. They may spend another $200-300 billion more to bail out the oil patch and so forth. And bail out the states, right, which they haven't put any money up for yet, and therefore the pension funds. I don't see a lot more money being expended on this. And if it relapses, I think they'll just bite their lip and let it happen. And then, of course, the question is, we don't know what the health effects will really be, and all of this is going to hit the street about the time of the November election.
Thank you, Jack. This is fascinating. I'm really enjoying hearing you explain all these things. I have two small questions. One is if we force the banks or push the banks to add mortgage payments to the end of the term of the loan, what's the big deal for them? How much does that impact the stability of the whole financial system? Is it a small piece relatively or a bigger piece relatively? And then the other one was, if we reopen the economy and you have deaths as a result of the reopening, doesn't that also impact the economy in terms of disruption in their supply chain and manufacturing and so on?
Well, I'll take your last question first. Yes, of course. If we have a worse infection and death rate, we're not too far from frontline workers, who deliver your food and handle the healthcare system and the transport system and so forth. I think walking off the job at some point, if it's worse, they're going to say, I'm going to take care of my family, and it's not worth it, especially if we don't compensate them enough. You hear all these nice words about, they're heroes, but no one's paying them for the hazard, if they are heroes and they're keeping the whole damn thing going, in the food plants and so forth, well, then we ought to be recognizing them not with just nice words, but recognizing them with some sort of benefit and compensation, risk for all this, but they don't want to spend that kind of money. I think, what was your first question? The first one was?
The first question was, what happens to the banks if they put the payments at the end of the term of the loan?
Well, essentially nothing for the banks. They just service these loans, right? It won't change their situation very much. So to do that doesn't create more financial instability. What it means is that the investors in these mortgages will have to take a haircut, as they say, right? And investors take a haircut all the time when the hedge funds and so forth, when they invest in Argentina and these other places, and then they can't pay those loans, and the IMF steps in and says, okay, you know, you got to accept less back, and Argentina has to pay some of it. You know, well, let's compromise here. You got to take a haircut, investors. Or the same thing in Greece, right? In Italy, you got to take a haircut. Well, this happens all the time, but what you got are the investors that are providing the money capital for the mortgage and the housing sector don't want to take a haircut, right? Well, you know, if politicians, you know, had backbone, they'd say, well, this is no different than the haircuts you guys take in Argentina. If you're going to do it for Argentina, why can't you do it for America, right? So they're the ones who have to take a haircut. But the banks themselves, you know, they're just the middlemen when it comes to servicing mortgages.
Hey, this is great. I feel like I'm in one of your podcasts, so it's kind of cool. So my question is, what do you think is going to happen coming out of this about increasing consolidation of industries and monopolization in, you know, corporate America? I mean, we kind of know a little bit about like the retail clothing, Neiman Marcus, Macy's, you know, Nordstrom's. I mean, we hear about people not having enough cash on hand, going bankrupt. So I can imagine with, you know, smaller mom and pop stores, they're going to be done, you know, a lot of people. So what's going to happen to, I don't know, how do you see that kind of playing out?
Okay, a lot of the small ones are almost effectively done anyway. You know, they're not going to be able to come back, and the loans are just giving them sort of a short lease on life here. The big box retailers, they're going under. You know, there's no way that they're going to survive except by becoming more Amazon-like, you know, online. And, you know, the Walmarts and the Targets have already made much of that transition. And there'll be a period where there'll be a reduction in the physical locations. First, they will cut a lot of their stores. The malls will be in trouble because the anchors to the malls, you know, the Macy's, the Pennies and so forth, will be gone from many of these malls, and the malls will go bankrupt, and the investors, commercial property investors in malls are going to take big defaults and big losses. You know, the new normal as we come out of this is going to be people are going to get used to doing buying remotely more and more, and the place to be is in distribution and in warehousing and distribution. It's an Amazon world in the future, and less a physical retail world. And you could say the same thing about movie theaters. You know, people are going to get used to even more with Netflix and everything, and they're going to say, well, do I really want to go to the movie theater? I don't know who am I going to see there? You know, and just sitting 6 seats away from someone, I don't know if that's going to cut it either. I'll just watch you know, Netflix or Amazon or all of them that are popping up now on the media, right? So in short, you're going to see a steady decline in physical retail outlets, and the smaller ones are going to go under. The bigger ones will be able to borrow more and stay for a while, but they're going to eventually go under, many of them, some of them too. You'll always have some physical retail locations, but it'll be much reduced, and therefore the jobs will be much reduced, you see, because a lot of the part-time jobs were in retail and services and hospitality and so forth. But a lot of those jobs are going away. The same thing for restaurants, you see. Restaurants will be a lot of takeout. You know, it may come back a little bit, but the business model is going to have to change dramatically in retail. And it will, but it will mean less jobs, less employment.
Just wanted to say thanks again to Jack and definitely to the facilitator for this event. Definitely think it's very informative. My question was, considering that financial capital has been dominating the country for at least a couple decades, the diminished industrial power, you mentioned the AI effect, the triple crises forcing capitalism to shift. Are there any specific recommendations for how the working class might leverage the power of the working class to lead towards a radical shift that supports workers at the expense of capital? Or more simply, what exactly is the leverage or power of the working class amidst these impending shifts?
Well, you know, that's the bottom line, I guess. And the question whether we drifted to a corporatist, proto-fascist kind of economy and system here the next decade, or whether we resist that and push it in a more progressive area. Well, two things have to happen among many here, and that is we're going to have to somehow revitalize our unions as a way of defending ourselves. You know, I see probably a unionization of Amazon and some of these other places that will occur in the future. You already see the workers there walking out in Wildcats and everything. You know, that's a sign that they're young people, you know, most of them young people, because it's hard work working in a warehouse. You know, I'm very optimistic about the millennials and the Gen Zers, you know, the next generation coming, because they've been taking the brunt of what's been happening for the last decade or so. And they're going to take it even more so in the next decade. And you already see signs that they're kind of waking up. You know, that's the most optimistic thing, and getting political. You know, majority of them say they're socialists. They don't know what that means. They just mean, they know it means not the above, you know, anything but this, right? So there's great opportunities there with the millennials, because the conditions are forcing it with them. They're the folks that are going to be whacked by artificial intelligence and the destruction of available cheap jobs. You know, they won't even be able to get that. They're the ones whose standard of living and hope for the future is going to be, you know, really challenged, and they know it. They know it. And the question is, can the unions at least, although I'm not too optimistic on some of the unions, haven't been in unions for 15 years myself as a local president and organizer and a strike leader and everything. I kind of know that scene. And I'm not too optimistic that the top leaders are going to do anything about it. As the crisis gets worse, they're going to tie themselves to the apron strings of the Democratic Party even more. But will the local union, more progressive young people in local unions, do something and break in a new direction? That remains to be seen. Hopefully it's true, but I do know that the way the law is set up in this country, the labor law, it's very, very easy for the leadership at the top to put their thumb down on local leaders who get out of shape, you know, who go their own way. The laws are favoring them to be able to squash rebellions at the local level. Which means probably, you know, the only way is a new political movement and a new political form of organization, a founding convention for a new party made up of delegates who are leading real people, not intellectuals, you know, who are saying, let's form a new party, right? That goes nowhere. It's got to be real people with real movements coming together at some point and saying, okay, you know, we need a new form of organization. Right now, that is really still tied to the Democratic Party, you know, the Our Revolution group, the OR group, and this whole fantasy about inside-outside strategy, you know, work within the Democratic Party to reform it, and outside, let's mobilize the people outside. I think the Democrats got about 6 months to prove whether that works or not. If it doesn't, then people are going to give up on the inside-outside strategy, and they're going to say, well, we got to do this outside, right? And then we'll see a new political formation after the election, really. Not much is going to happen in that regard before. But the solution has to be a political movement, I believe, and the political, you know, the organization question, as I talked about last November, is the question, I think. The conditions are there, the conditions are getting worse, and people need hope. You know, a real viable organization, I think people will flock to it, you know, but individual workers, you know, they're not going to jump out all by themselves. They're going to be very careful about their own condition and their family and everything, and they're not going to go with, you know, wackos. You know, they're not going to go around throwing trash cans through windows, right? That's no solution. And they know it, but I think they're yearning for a real alternative. And you know, even those who jump behind Bernie Sanders, you know, many of them are disenchanted now. You know, Bernie threw in the towel pretty damn quick, you know, and support Biden. And I'm not so sure Biden can win, given the Electoral College and the way everything is set up. Maybe if they had a candidate like Jack Kennedy or something, they may have a better chance. But with Biden, I think it's really questionable. It's a 50-50 chance. It's going to take some organization to question, and I don't have a crystal ball for that.
Well, basically, that was my question. I was going to ask about the opportunities for people that believe in another world, for people that the opportunities for organizing, our role, and where should we start? If you ask me, I don't see the political thing. Like right now, people are so desperate, like in the community, like the undocumented people right now are having a really hard time. And I do not see the political thing happening without like just satisfying their needs, like coming together and organizing mutual aid to satisfy those needs first, or as we go together into a political movement where we ask for not only the necessary things to survive, but also the extension of and guarantee of rights and et cetera, And I come from Puerto Rico, and in Puerto Rico, there has been some development after the Hurricane Maria, after the earthquakes, and after all the stuff that has been going down there. There's a lot of organizations that have risen as a result of all that, and there's a lot of community-based organizations, and that's really changing the way people do politics in Puerto Rico. Honestly, there's a lot of people that are questioning things more and willing to do other things, and so that.
Well, my answer to that would be it starts at the local level, and people have to get together to do what they can to defend themselves at the local level. But then the leaders of these local movements have to realize that whatever your single organization and your single issue is, you can only take it so far, and not very far often, that you have to join together under a bigger umbrella with other people. And when I said people who are real, people who are in the fight, in the struggle, who are organizing under local issues, right, have to realize at some point, let's get together. And what you need then is to call a convention of movements, of real people, real leaders of real movements. And at the convention, you develop a program and you select an interim leadership that's recallable immediately, right? Very democratic. And then you from these regional conventions or gatherings, then you call a national convention. Then you can create a political party of various interests, but it's got to be real people leading real movements. Those are the people who should be the delegates to these founding conventions. First regional conventions, maybe, in Southern California or something, or, where you have a lot of Latinos, and then, expand it from there. But people are still going, workers always take the easy way out first. They got to find that the easy way doesn't work. They'll always try the easy way first. They got to go through the whole process of it. And, they're going to go one more time here, the easy way, and that is Democratic Party, right? But if the Democratic Party does not win in November, or if it wins and it pulls an Obama, where in other words, it says what it's going to walk the walk, but talk the talk, doesn't walk the walk, right? Then you got the evidence that that's not the solution anymore. And yeah, it's going to be really tough, but we got to go the hard route, right? We got to do it ourselves. Right? No one's going to do it for you. It's like organizing workers in a union, No one's going to do it for you. You got to do it for yourself. You got to take the risk. You got to do the hard work. And I believe young people will come to that realization because, they got their whole life before them, and they're very hopeful, and they haven't been beaten and battered down for 50 years, right? And they'll do it. I really think they will do it, But it's going to take convincing them that there is no other way out except doing it yourself independently. But, it starts at the local level. Do what you can do with other people, right now in the meantime. But keep your eyes and ears open for others who are there to do it as well.
Thank you, Jack. I think, many of us very much agree with that point, that it really depends on ourselves. We need to build organizations.
Yeah, if I could interrupt, when I was a union organizer for years, I'd go to a factory or a business, and we talk about, if you got to talk people into wanting a union, forget it, right? They already want a union, you just show them how to do it. And, many of them first say, well, what are you going to do for me? And I would say, I'm not going to do a damn thing for you. You're going to do it for yourself. I'm just going to show you what obstacles to avoid along the way, right? It changes the whole attitude. People got to realize that they're the only ones that are going to do it for themselves. No one else is going to do it for you. Go ahead. Sorry about that. I just had to reminisce a bit.
No worries. No, I think I'm not the only one who really is appreciating you taking the time. And my question is, on one of your articles I read, where you're talking about the huge buildup of debt and basically this idea of the fuel, that the fuel exists, and it, as you said, there's all this liquidity and all this stuff coming from the last crisis. And then the question is, where does the spark come from? And I was wondering what your thoughts on that are, because right now it seems like the shelter in place and the lack of demand obviously seems like that's causing the collapse in prices that you were saying is really needed to put this all ablaze. But to me it seems like there's also questions of overproduction that are built into capitalist economy and all of that. And also, so the question is related to, what if the shelter in place orders are lifted and you do have demand again? Do you think that prices would bounce back and that spark would not reach the fuel? What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Well, if it's lifted, as I said before, it's not going to come back to where it was for the reasons I gave before. It's going to be very slow coming back. And the question is, if it's slow and you got the slow growth, then if the demand and consumption does not come back, then you got businesses that will default because they don't have enough revenue, cash flow, to pay their debts, the massive load of debt they got. You see, it's not just the total debt you got, but whether you can pay it. And the more you got, of course, the harder it is to pay it. And when you got a recession, you got nothing to pay it with, right? You have no revenue, you got no sales. And that's why the government has to step in and give you money if you're a business, right? Loans and grants, so you can keep paying your debt. Because if you don't pay your debt and you default, well, that's when it begins to spill over to the banking system. And that's when you have real problems, right? When it spills over to the banking system. So we're not at that point. It's a whole process. And you could have, 2 steps forward or 1 step back kind of a thing here going on. It looks like when you come out and people go back to work, you'll get some recovery back. But then if you have a second massive wave of the virus, well, then what do? Right? There'll be calls for going back into sheltering. We came out too soon. Right? And then there'll be a political fight, those who don't want to come back. And therefore they'll accept the increased death rate, and those who will. So no one knows, who will prevail in that. I just think that if we have a wave before the election, they won't go back into shelter in place. They may freeze where they are, but the economy is too important to people with a lot of money. Businesses who see the possibility they lose everything. If the economy does not come back, and if everyone stays in shelter, they're not going to want to accept losing everything. They'll accept somebody's death if they can save their company. You see, That's the way they think. So it's hard to answer your question specifically, except we're going to have these countervailing forces, for and against the recovery that are going to play out against each other back and forth over the next 6 months.
Thanks a lot, Jack. I appreciate it. I just had one comment with the on the question of how there's been a shift today, not even on the economic level, but the attention that people have been paying to what's going on because of the impact. And that's what's been called essential workers and that sort of thing. And the consciousness, the increased consciousness of who's essential and who's not. We have corporate offices shut down and systems run fine without those people. So there's more and more awareness. And as people start to can get the information, the kind of perspective that you're presenting of the trillions and upon trillions that go to the banks and the large corporations, well, people are really suffering and really they are. I think we see a real possibility like we haven't seen in a long time for a major political shift. And I don't think it's, people may follow Trump because he has, of course, Sleepy Joe, I don't think is going to attract very much attention. How could he? I don't think he instills much confidence. I wanted to go back to the question that I think it was Moore asked on the question of extreme climate disruption, because it's not just a matter of something that we can throw money at or they can throw. We don't have money to throw at it, but money can be thrown at to change this with the centrality of oil and the whole system of production and everything that's linked to that, agribusiness, big agribusiness, pharma, et cetera. The idea that somehow we're going to be able to build enough walls or something to withstand this, the impending collapse is, I just don't see it at all. I think that what we're starting to see and what we're seeing right now in India, for instance, and when the virus hits there even harder, the Sahel region of Africa, other places, Syria, that have been really stricken by drought, we're beginning to see major crop disruptions. We're seeing it right now. We're not even feeling the impact of what the farmers have had to plow under and everything because of lack of supply chains and so on. So I guess the main question, from an economic perspective, it has to do with the centrality of oil. And do you think really that this system, those who run this system, will be able and ready to take on that force?
Take on what, oil?
The oil, the big oil, and all that's linked to it. Archer Daniels Midland, Monsanto, and on and on and on. And it's not just national, it's international.
Yeah, well, if you look at oil, of course, it's collapsing as never before, the global price of oil, as a result of the fact that the global economy is in demand has collapsed. And there's been so much oversupply of oil, driven largely by the U.S. fracking companies, 13 million barrels a day, when even the Saudis are only producing 10 million barrels a day. And then you have bin Salman in Saudi Arabia increasing the supply as a way of trying to drive the U.S. fracking companies out of business. And they're getting close to that as the price, falls below $10, $15 a barrel. That's been the whole idea. But oil itself is not the energy of the future. Very clearly, what we've got is a shift away from oil to other forms of energy. Of course, oftentimes it's natural gas, which is also carbon-based. And not really a long-term solution. But I don't think, to support what you're saying, I don't think the governments that exist today are really going to do anything about it. They will try to deal with case-by-case crises, climate crisis as it gets worse. But those who will take the biggest brunt are going to be in the emerging market economies. Folks, will actually starve as a result of the climate change. But it will have more and more effect, on other places in the in the developed economies as well. We can already see that happening in North America. So I guess I'm not too optimistic that economically oil will be dealt with. The challenge of carbon and oil will be dealt with, because, as you point out, it's too deeply economically and politically entrenched within the system. They're too powerful, and no one's really going to take it on. If anything, Trump is going to try to bail out the fracking sector here in the United States, given the collapse of oil. And he'll probably use the Federal Reserve to do that, because most of that is junk bond debt. And they already said the Fed is going to buy junk bond debt. So they'll just give the Fed more money to buy junk bond debt. And at the same time, they will, Trump has already said, we're going to buy your oil from you and you just leave it in the ground. Well, what is that? That's a direct handout. That's not even buying the oil and put it in the petroleum reserve. That's saying we're going to pay you for the oil that you have, and then you can sell it again later and make double profits off of it, and that's just a direct handout. That's all that is. But you may see some consolidation of all these drillers and frackers, and you'll see the big companies, the big oil companies, buying them up at pennies on the dollar. That will be the solution here to the crisis in the fracking industry. But the problem is, there's too much oil in the world. Too much oil, and now with less demand, you really see the problem, but there's still too much oil. The Russians and the Saudis and OPEC and everybody's pumping this oil, and there's just not that much demand for it anymore. And then the demand that there was collapsed, and you get what you got now.
I sort of had a question relating to that, but I think I'll skip it. I want to know, I'm confused about how when the federal government just kind of pushes all of the responsibility for responding to the crisis onto individual states, where do the states get their funding and resources, and how much is the federal government actually a detriment and really standing in the way of states being able to, actually deal with this crisis? And then when the Fed is pumping in all of this money, and states are going to go more and more in debt in order to address the coronavirus crisis and everything, then I don't know if you could just discuss a little bit more of that relationship.
Okay. Well, states do not have a central bank like the Fed. Only the government, national government, has a central bank. So they can't create money to spend. Where do the states get their funding and financing? Well, they get it from their tax system. They may have an individual income tax, they may have a corporate tax, they have sales taxes and so forth, property taxes. That's where they raise their money from. They also get a lot of money from the federal government to provide for education costs and other costs. So that's part of what's called the federalism system. The federal government shares some of its money to the states, because it's the states that really implement the federal programs. It's state level employees that actually, implement unemployment insurance, implement mortgages and so forth, and transport and education. They are the fiscal agents, you might say, for the federal government. Now, the problem is the federal government does not want to really support those states that are blue states. You say we got this ideological divide, and that's why you got Mitch McConnell saying, "Oh, I'm not going to approve any more bailout for the states." What it really means is he's going to let the blue states go. And let them have a bigger crisis, because there will be a crisis if they don't bail out the states. And the crisis will be not only the states not being able to pay for education, not being able to pay for fire and police services and transport, DMVs and all the other services, right? They won't be able to do it. They'll have to lay off state employees, and those services will get worse. That's not just the problem, but the states, if they go in the red, then they can't borrow in what's called the municipal bond market. The borrowing as a way of making up for lack of federal funds becomes harder and harder. They got to pay more and more. They're frozen out of the bond markets, you might say, as a source of revenue to continue the states. Then you got other problems, because the pension funds invest heavily in the states and in the municipal bond market. And if the municipal bond market goes under, then the pension funds go under. So Mitch McConnell may be too dumb or maybe too smart, but there's no way he can afford not to bail out the states if this continues. But it's a political thing right now, political football, because the blue states are not Trump states, you see, and they're the states that need it most because they're the states with the greatest population and concentration of population. Plus, they're the states that provide more benefits to their citizens than the red states do. There's a crisis in state funding that's going to develop very quickly if something isn't done very soon. But I think they will probably, before the election, throw some money, not as much as the Democrats want, but they'll throw some token money at the states to get them through the rest of the year. Won't alleviate the crisis.
Professor Rasmus, I have a question. Given all the pressure from international capital, what do you see the next 3, 6, in the next year for the people of Venezuela? What do you think the prospects for Maduro and the workers there and their standard of living within the next year?
Well, I would encourage you to read an article I wrote about a year ago about financial imperialism, the case of Venezuela, which on my blog, jackrasmus.com, which really describes how the U.S. has undermined the Venezuelan economy by destroying its currency. I'm not going to go into all the technical details how that was done, but that has a lot to do with why Venezuela is struggling. Of course, Venezuela depends on 95% of its funding for its government depends on the sale of oil. When the oil prices collapse like this, it's in further trouble. And the sanctions, not only on Venezuela buying things, but trying to sell its oil, and the U.S. Grabbing its Citgo oil company here, refinery company in the U.S., and denying other companies from dealing with Venezuela, not just the U.S. companies, but companies in Europe and so forth under the threat of sanctions, you see. That's a big tool of U.S. imperialism, the sanctions, but controlling the currency, which you can do because of the dollar is the global currency, the imperial currency. You can destroy another country's currency and really undermine it economically and politically. And I would add something that people probably aren't aware of, and that is, I think it's quite likely that Trump, if he's in trouble before the election, will precipitate a war somewhere. And I think the likely candidate would be Venezuela or Iran. But I think Venezuela. He doesn't need to get the support of Europe and so forth as he would have to if he went after Iran. But he already has that with right-wing governments in South America to go after Venezuela. And a couple of weeks ago, I discovered that the U.S. has sent a task force, a naval task force to Venezuela to blockade the sale and the movement of oil because it was still selling oil to Cuba, right? And Cuba was then selling it to the rest of the world on behalf of Venezuela. So the U.S. sent a fairly large task force of ships. I'm talking about dozens of ships, which is kind of a serious move. And I don't know if they set up yet offshore Venezuela, but they're preparing to do that. And that's really a double way of going after Cuba as well as Venezuela. I think, the timing of that will depend upon whether Trump feels he's really needs a diversion, and in which case he will precipitate something against Venezuela. Probably a blockade, not an invasion, but a definite blockade, kind of like the Cuban blockade of '62, something like that. That's very likely, very possible. So the prospect with falling oil and that is not great for Venezuela, unfortunately.
Hi, I was listening to what you were saying about forming a political party, the opportunity to form like a political party in the next coming years, and about having like a regional conference, and then like having a local one, and then having a state one. I agree with you, but my question is, do you think that a political party with like a serious left political ideology would be successful in like redirecting resources to people like in this current political party, like two-party paradigm? And then if so, what are your thoughts on some effective strategies a newly formed like political party with serious like left ideology would be?
Well, you know, left ideology is a broad spectrum, right?
Right.
I mean, it's got to be a party that clearly appeals as well to small businesses that are taking it in the ear, to various ethnic groups and minority groups, to the more progressive wing of the working class. You know, it's got to be an umbrella of sorts. But it's got to be independent, you see, independent of the Democrats, I believe. And what's going to happen is the Democrat Party has to implode first, I believe. And this party has to be there to step in the vacuum. And the possibility of the Democrats, you know, not nationwide, but, you know, in various states and regions where they don't have a solution, imploding is very real after November. But if you don't have an organization and you're not moving in that direction by then, 2021, well, there's nothing to step in the vacuum, and you would have a reconstituting of the Democratic Party under another name or something. So the opportunities are there, and it's not just holding conventions statewide, local, statewide, but there has to be a national founding convention of some sort at some point. But the Democratic Party has to implode in part, at least, before you can have an organization like this step in. And it's got to fail. It's got to be shown that it has no solution, you know, to the crisis, or it has no solution for dealing with Trump and the forces and the movement behind Trump, you know. And so far, they performed, the Democrats, quite poorly in dealing with Trump. You know, he's outmaneuvered them in a number of ways on a number of times here. And I don't know that they have the kind of leadership, quality of leadership that can rise to actually take on Trump successfully. Plus, you know, they got a real uphill fight because of the way we have the electoral system and the way we've gerrymandered the red states and the voter suppression going on, particularly in the red states, you know, that plays into the gerrymandering and plays into electoral college. This is something that represents the decline of American democracy on a number of fronts going on. That is a very serious uphill contest, even for the Democratic Party, you see. But they didn't do so well, you know, I think in denying the youth movement around Sanders and picking an octogenarian to lead them into this next. I mean, if they were really smart, they would nominate someone totally different at their convention, but I don't think they're that smart.
Thank you so much for such a great discussion. I have sort of a big question, but what I'd like to ask is, so far we've sort of, this discussion has been framed entirely as sort of a recovery within the context of the current economic system. And I want to know if there are ways, what it will take, whether we should, and how we can start to reframe or reconceptualize sort of what our value is placed on and what an economic structure even looks like, given that this one obviously isn't working, which you've shown through a lot of insane information. Thanks.
Well, it's kind of hard to predict an economic structure or a political structure before it actually emerges. I'd be reluctant to go too far in doing that. I think that will be defined pretty much by the people who lead the movement, you know. Certainly it will be something where people will try to create their own authority locally to take care of their own issues, you know. It's quite possible that if the parts of the system, the economic system, begin to fail, and by what I mean by that is like the food system, the food delivery system, right? If that begins to fail, and it could if you have a second or third wave here, and you already see signs of it, people really getting infected in meat packs and processing and so forth, there will come a point where the demand of the day will be, well, look, you got to take over and run those factories for the rest of the people. You got to distribute it for the rest of the people. And maybe management or will abandon it, will abandon their plants, right? Or the owners will abandon it, and you got to keep these things going. So at that point, the workers themselves have to step in and keep the system going in a sense, right? But that creates a big change in their consciousness and a big change in creating alternative structures, economic and political, to maintain, prevent a collapse, and it's in that kind of crisis that people will innovate as to what they need to do to prevent the collapse. Other than that, I don't think I'm going to venture into predicting what it will look like. Certainly not, history here and there and so forth. You can't just replicate what's happened before. It'll happen in its own way here in the USA. But, I think people, particularly young people, are very imaginative and bold, and they'll step up and they'll do something. I guess that's the most optimistic thing I see. Despite all the crisis that we got going on and how bleak everything looks, the big bright light is, people under 30, 35, I think, who have their life in front of them, they're not going to just capitulate and give up, they're going to try something, and maybe it won't always work, but they're going to step up and do it, and they're the majority now, and I think they'll do it. I really do. It won't be easy, but they'll have to, and therefore they will.